They say love is blind, but looking back at my 3-year relationship with Liam, I realize I wasn't just blind, I was willfully hallucinating. I grew up in a foster system that felt more like a revolving door than a home. So when Liam looked at me with those soft hazel eyes and promised me a forever, I clung to it like a life raft in a hurricane. I lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment with a radiator that hissed like an angry cat and a window that rattled every time a truck drove by, and I loved every square inch of it because he was there. I was a orphan with nothing, or at least, that's the version of me he knew. I didn't tell him about the $100 million trust fund sitting in a high-security vault at Heritage Investment, waiting for me to turn 25. I didn't tell him because I wanted to be certain that, if a man loved me, he loved the girl who shared a $5 pizza on a Tuesday night, not the girl who could buy the pizza company and the entire city block it sat on. Liam worked at his family's bank, a mid-sized institution that boasted about tradition and legacy, but always seemed to smell faintly of desperation and old paper. His mother, Beatrice, was the human embodiment of a cold front. She didn't walk into a room, she colonized it. Every time we met, her eyes would rake over my thrift store sweater, as if she were inspecting a flea for a contagious disease. She never called me Elara. To her, I was the girl from the system, a title she spat out with a delicate curl of her lip. I tolerated it. I swallowed the bile that rose in my throat every time she made a backhanded comment about my lack of breeding, because I thought Liam was worth it. I thought his silence during her tirades was just him being a good son caught in the middle. I didn't realize that in the ecosystem of the narcissistic, silence isn't neutrality. It's an endorsement. Our wedding was supposed to be the bridge that finally brought me into their world. Liam had been stressed, his face turning a sallow shade of gray as the bank faced what he called liquidity hiccups. Being the secret guardian of a fortune, I knew the truth. I knew his family bank was hemorrhaging cash, and I had been quietly directing the Heritage Fund to stabilize their assets. I was their anonymous savior, the invisible hand keeping their lights on, all while Beatrice was trying to figure out how to keep me from staining the family portraits. It's a special kind of irony, really, paying the mortgage for the people who think you aren't good enough to sit at their table. It's like being the secret author of a book that's currently being used to hit you over the head. The week of the wedding, the air changed. It became heavy, charged with a static I couldn't quite explain. Beatrice had insisted on a small private rehearsal dinner at their estate, a sprawling cold mansion in the hills that felt more like a museum for people who died hating each other. As I walked up the marble steps, my heart felt like a trapped bird fluttering against my ribs. I wore a simple white dress I'd found at a vintage shop, tailored to perfection. I thought I looked beautiful. Beatrice, draped in silk that probably cost more than my first foster home, looked me up and down and sighed. "It's so brave of you to wear something so historical, Elara. Most girls would want to look like they actually belong at a gala, but I suppose we must make do with what we have." I just smiled, my fingers digging into my palms until I could feel the crescents of my nails. I kept telling myself, just one more day. Tomorrow, I'll be his wife, and she'll just be a memory. I was so tragically wrong. The restaurant was one of those places where the lighting is so dim you can barely see the exorbitant prices on the menu, and the waiters move with a silent, judgmental grace. Beatrice had chosen the royal room, a space dripping with gold leaf and heavy velvet curtains that seemed to swallow every ounce of oxygen. I walked in, expecting to find my seat next to Liam, but as I scanned the long, ornate table, I realized there was no place card with my name on it near the family end. Instead, I found myself relegated to the very edge, tucked away near the swinging doors of the kitchen, where the smell of dish soap fought with the scent of expensive truffles. It was a calculated move, a physical manifestation of where she thought I ranked in her hierarchy. Just a notch above the service staff. Liam was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by Beatrice and his father. He looked striking in his charcoal suit, the Rolex on his wrist catching the dim light with every movement. My heart twinged. I had authorized the Heritage Fund to gift that watch to him through an anonymous corporate incentive program just last month, knowing he was feeling emasculated by the bank's failing numbers. I wanted him to feel powerful. I wanted him to feel like the man I believed he was. But as I sat there, 30 feet away from him, he didn't even look up. He was busy laughing at something his mother whispered in his ear, his thumb nervously stroking the watch face. A watch bought with my money, worn while he ignored my existence. The guest list was a who's who of the city's banking elite, and as the first course was served, Beatrice's voice rose above the clinking of silverware like a sharpened blade. "You know," she began, her eyes drifting toward me with a casual cruelty that made the hair on my arms stand up. "There's a certain tragic beauty in wildflowers. They're resilient, I'll give them that. They grow in the dirt, they cost absolutely nothing to maintain, and they're quite charming in a rustic sort of way." She paused to take a delicate sip of a vintage red that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "But a wildflower, no matter how much it tries to bloom, can never be placed in a royal crystal vase. It simply doesn't have the structure. It wilts under the pressure of true elegance." A few of the socialites at the table chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that echoed in the cavernous room. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, a prickling sensation that started at my collarbone and crawled up to my ears. I looked at Liam, pleading with my eyes for him to say something, anything, to defend the woman he claimed to love. But he just kept staring at his plate, meticulously cutting a piece of Wagyu beef as if it were a surgical procedure. He was a coward, and for the first time, the realization didn't just hurt. It felt like a cold stone settling in my stomach. The good son act was starting to look a lot like a co-conspirator's mask. "Elara, dear," Beatrice continued, her voice dripping with mock concern, "I do hope you aren't offended. I'm just being realistic. Since you don't have a family of your own to guide you, I feel it's my duty to manage your expectations. We are a family of legacy. Our name is etched into the very foundations of this city's financial district. You are a blank page. And while that's lovely for a diary, it's quite a liability for a dynasty." She gestured vaguely toward the empty chairs at my end of the table. "It's a shame none of your acquaintances could make it. But then again, I suppose finding someone with a clean background check in your circles must be quite the challenge." The insult hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. My breath hitched, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt. She wasn't just calling me poor. She was calling me a criminal, a nobody, a ghost. I looked down at my hands resting on the white linen tablecloth. They were trembling, but not from sadness. It was a low-frequency hum of pure, unadulterated rage. I thought about the Heritage Fund. I thought about the $50 million I had moved just 72 hours ago to prevent her precious legacy from being liquidated by federal regulators. I was the only reason she still had a house to sleep in. Yet here she was, treating me like a weed she had accidentally tracked in on her shoe. I took a deep breath, forcing my lungs to expand against the suffocating tension of the room. I reached for my water glass, my movements slow and deliberate. I needed to play the part. I needed to be the broken orphan for just a few more hours. If I revealed my hand now, I'd lose the chance to see the look on her face when the floor finally dropped out from under her. "I understand my place, Beatrice," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet it somehow carried across the sudden silence of the table. "I know exactly what I am to this family." Liam finally looked at me then, but there was no love in his gaze. There was only a flickering shadow of annoyance, as if my presence was a smudge on an otherwise perfect evening. "Don't be sensitive, Elara," he muttered, loud enough for the guests nearby to hear. "Mother is just looking out for us. You should be grateful you're even getting our last name. It's the most valuable thing you'll ever own." He turned back to his mother and smiled, and in that moment, The man I thought I loved died. In his place sat a hollow shell, a puppet draped in expensive fabric, dancing to the tune of a woman who fed on the misery of others. I sat there for the rest of the night, a silent ghost at my own wedding celebration, listening to them talk about breeding and assets, all while I mentally began to calculate the exact cost of their destruction. Just as the dessert was being served, a delicate gold-flecked soufflé that tasted like dust in my mouth, Beatrice signaled to her assistant. A heavy, leather-bound folder was placed on the table, its presence as ominous as a tombstone. The clinking of crystal died down instantly. Everyone knew what was coming. They leaned in, their eyes gleaming with the predatory hunger of the social elite watching a public execution. Beatrice slid the folder across the long table. It skidded over the silk runner and stopped right in front of my water glass. "This," Beatrice announced, her voice resonating with a terrifying calm authority, "is what we call a poverty waiver. Our legal team spent weeks perfecting it. Since you bring nothing to this union but your unfortunate circumstances, Elara, it's only fair that you sign away any claim to the family estate, the bank, or even the alimony should things not work out. It's a protection of our bloodline from external contamination." She didn't use the word parasite, but it hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. She handed me a fountain pen, its gold nib glinting under the chandelier. "Sign it now, in front of our friends. Show us that you aren't the gold-digging orphan everyone assumes you are." The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in until I could hear the frantic rhythm of my own pulse in my ears. I looked down at the document. It was 50 pages of legal jargon designed to strip me of my humanity. It stated that in the event of Liam's death or a divorce, I would be entitled to exactly $0. I would leave with nothing but the clothes on my back, the very wildflower existence Beatrice so mocked. I looked at the faces around the table. They weren't shocked. They were nodding. To them, this was justice. This was how the world was supposed to work. "Beatrice," I whispered, my voice trembling as I looked up. "We're getting married in less than 24 hours. You're asking me to sign this in front of everyone? Like I'm a business transaction?" She laughed, a sharp, melodic sound that chilled me to the bone. "You are a transaction, Elara. We are providing you with a name, a status, and a roof that doesn't leak. The least you can do is sign a piece of paper that ensures you won't try to rob us blind later. Don't let your greed stain my son's big day. You should be grateful we're even letting you sign it, instead of just calling off the whole charade." I turned to Liam, my last shred of hope flickering like a candle in a gale. His face was a mask of cold indifference. He didn't look at the document, and he didn't look at me. He just sipped his wine, the Rolex I bought him catching the light as he set his glass down. "Just sign it, Elara," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "It's the only way Mother will ever accept you. If you love me, you'll prove that the money doesn't matter. Or was that all a lie? Are you only here for the prestige of being a Lancaster?" The gaslighting was so seamless, so polished that for a split second, I actually felt a wave of guilt. That's the thing about people like them. They make you feel like the villain for wanting the bare minimum of respect. They weaponize your own heart against you. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. My body was screaming at me to run, to scream, to flip the table and reveal the truth. I could have told them right then that my orphan background included a trust fund that could buy their bank 3 times over. I could have told them that Beatrice's legacy was currently being propped up by my money. But then a strange, icy calm washed over me. It was the information gap in action. I realized that if I signed this now, I was setting the ultimate trap. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy, like a weapon. I looked at Beatrice, who was wearing a smirk of pure, narcissistic triumph. She thought she had won. She thought she had finally put the stray in her place. I'll sign, I said, my voice suddenly steady. I flipped to the last page and scrawled my signature. But as I did, I made sure to initial a small, handwritten clause I had surreptitiously drafted and slipped into the back of the stack when I accidentally dropped the folder earlier. A clause that stated this waiver was only valid if the marriage was terminated by the bride, and that any pre-existing corporate investments made by the bride's affiliates would be subject to immediate withdrawal with a 200% penalty should the groom's family breach the good faith moral conduct of the contract. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so eager to see me humiliated, that they didn't even bother to check the page numbers or the fine print. There, I said, sliding the folder back to her. It's done. I have nothing, and I want nothing from you. Beatrice snatched the folder away like it was a trophy. Good. Now perhaps we can enjoy the rest of the evening without any more of your dramatics. She turned to the table and raised her glass. To the Lancaster legacy, may it remain pure and prosperous. I sat there, watching them toast to a future that was already crumbling beneath their feet. I watched Liam smile, thinking he had secured his CEO promotion by pacifying his mother. I wondered if he would still be smiling when he realized he had just signed the death warrant for his family's empire. I had traded my pride for a few hours of silence, but in return, I had gained the keys to their prison. Have you ever had to trade your self-respect for a fake kind of love, just to wait for the perfect moment to burn the whole house down? The house was unnervingly still after the dinner guests departed. The kind of silence that feels heavy and thick, like a burial shroud. I was staying in one of the guest rooms on the east wing, but sleep was a stranger to me. My mind was a whirlwind of the day's humiliations, yet a part of me, the foolish, desperate part, was still trying to convince myself that once the rings were on our fingers, Liam would protect me. I decided to head downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water, my bare feet padding softly on the cold marble of the hallway. As I passed Beatrice's study, a sliver of amber light spilled out from the slightly ajar double doors. I heard a muffled laugh, sharp, jagged, and devoid of the polished grace she wore in public. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs like a fist against a door. I shouldn't have listened. I should have kept walking. But my intuition, that primal instinct that had kept me alive in the foster system, screamed at me to stay. The signature is the only thing that mattered, Liam. Beatrice's voice drifted through the gap, sounding oily and satisfied. With that waiver signed, the girl is legally a ghost. She has no family to come looking for her, no estate to claim her remains. She's the perfect vessel. But, Mother! Liam's voice sounded muffled, strained, but not with protest, with anxiety. The bank's audit is in 3 weeks. Even with her signing away the rights, we're still $40 million short. The creditors are circling. If we don't show a massive influx of liquidity, the regulators will shut us down by the end of the month. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold shiver cascading down my spine that turned my limbs to lead. 40 million? They were in far worse shape than my analysts had predicted. I leaned closer, my ear inches from the wood, my breath coming in shallow, silent hitches. That's why the honeymoon in the Maldives is so vital, Beatrice replied, the clink of a glass against a decanter punctuating her words. I've already secured the unauthorized medication from our contact. It's a specialized substance, tasteless, and impossible to detect in a standard tox screen. A few drops in her morning tea over a week, and she'll start experiencing dizzy spells, a severe nerve trauma that will look like a tragic, spontaneous medical episode. When she eventually has her accident on the balcony or in the water, the insurance payout will be swift. I took out a $50 million key person policy on her life months ago. The bank will be saved, and we'll be rid of the Wildflower before she can even finish her first bouquet. My stomach did a violent somersault. I had to grip the doorframe to keep from collapsing. They weren't just taking my dignity. They were planning to harvest my life like a crop. I waited for Liam to scream. I waited for him to throw a chair, to defend me, to tell her she was a monster. Instead, there was a long, agonizing pause. Then, Liam spoke in a low, calculating tone. Will it hurt her? I mean, will the authorities suspect anything? If the investigation turns up the restricted substance, we're finished. Is it absolutely foolproof? It's as foolproof as her stupidity.
Liam, Beatrice hissed. She thinks she's marrying into a family. She's actually marrying into a life insurance claim. She's an orphan. No one will ask for an autopsy. No one will cry at the funeral except us. And we'll be crying all the way to the vault.
I suppose you're right, Liam sighed, and I could almost hear the shrug in his voice. It's for the family. The Lancaster name has to survive, no matter the cost. I'll make sure she drinks the tea. The world seemed to fracture around me. The man who had held me while I cried about my lonely childhood, the man who had promised to be my home, was currently discussing my expiration date over a glass of scotch. I felt a sudden, visceral heat behind my eyes. Not tears of sadness, but the kind of white-hot clarity that comes when you realize you are standing in the presence of pure evil.
My love for him didn't just die. It was incinerated, leaving nothing but the gray ash of contempt. I backed away from the door, my movements mechanical and ghostly. I made it back to my room, locking the door and sliding down against it, my skin crawling as if 1,000 insects were beneath the surface. I looked at the poverty waiver sitting on the nightstand. They thought I was a lamb walking to the slaughter, but they had no idea I was the one who owned the meadow. They needed 40 million to survive? I had 100 million, and by the time I was done, I wouldn't just deny them the money. I would ensure that the Lancaster name they loved so much would be synonymous with the very filth they claimed I came from. I opened my laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes like a predator's. I didn't need a wedding dress tomorrow. I needed a shroud for their empire. I began typing, my fingers flying across the keys with a lethal precision. I was no longer the girl seeking a family. I was the chairman of the Heritage Fund, and I was about to perform a hostile takeover of their souls. I sat on the edge of the bed, the silk sheets feeling like sandpaper against my skin. My lungs were burning, each breath a jagged struggle, as the reality of their betrayal settled into my marrow. I looked at my reflection in the vanity mirror, a pale, wide-eyed girl in a lace nightgown, and I didn't recognize her anymore. That girl was a victim. That girl was a ghost waiting to happen. I reached out and slammed the mirror face down. I didn't need a reflection. I needed a weapon. I pulled my laptop from its hidden compartment in my suitcase, the sleek black metal feeling cold and honest in a house built on lies. This wasn't the cheap plastic laptop I used in front of Liam to check my emails. This was an encrypted workstation, a direct portal to the Heritage Investment Group. As the screen flickered to life, the blue light washed over my face, illuminating the cold, hard lines that had replaced my grief. I logged into the master dashboard, and for the first time in years, I let myself look at the numbers. $100 million. It wasn't just a number, it was a scoreboard. I pulled up the Lancaster Bank's private ledgers, files I had access to because, ironically, I was their largest anonymous creditor. My eyes scanned the red ink bleeding across their balance sheets. They were drowning. Last week, I had authorized a $50 million stabilization injection through a shell company called Silver Oak Holdings. I did it because I thought I was saving my future husband's legacy. I thought I was being a partner. I let out a sharp, dry laugh that sounded like breaking glass. I hadn't been saving a partner. I'd been feeding the monsters who were currently measuring my coffin. So, the wolves don't just want the sheep's wool, I whispered to the empty room, my voice sounding foreign even to me. They want the soul, too. My fingers danced across the keys with a lethal, rhythmic precision. Every click was a nail in the Lancaster coffin. I began the shadow strategy. First, I sent an encrypted message to my lead counsel at Heritage. Subject: Immediate asset relocation. Priority: Omega. I instructed them to prepare a full withdrawal of the Silver Oak Stabilization Fund, effective in 36 hours. That $50 million was the only thing keeping their vault doors from being chained shut by the feds. Taking it back wouldn't just hurt them. It would create a vacuum that would implode their entire structure. Next, I accessed the poverty waiver I had signed earlier. I had a digital copy of the original and the one I'd modified. I scanned the tiny microscopic clause I had added in the dark corners of page 49. I had phrased it as a standard conflict of interest and moral turpitude addendum. If the groom's party engaged in any criminal conspiracy or breach of good faith during the engagement period, the bride reserved the right to claim a predatory damages fee equal to 200% of any current investments held within the groom's institutions. Beatrice had been so busy gloating over my signature that she hadn't noticed she'd just signed a document that made me the legal owner of their debt. I felt a strange, visceral sensation in my chest. Not the fluttering of a broken heart, but the steady, heavy thrum of a machine powering up. I looked at the unauthorized medication Beatrice had mentioned. I did a quick search through the bank's internal expense reports. There it was, disguised as security consultant fees. They were so arrogant, they even used the company credit card to fund my demise. I leaned back, the hum of the laptop fan the only sound in the room. I could leave right now. I could call an Uber, disappear into the night, and bankrupt them from a beach in Fiji. But that was too easy. They wanted a show. They wanted the orphan to suffer in front of their high society friends. Fine. I would give them a performance they'd never forget. I would walk down that aisle. I would wear that veil. And I would wait until the very moment Beatrice thought she had secured her prize to pull the rug out from under her. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. A text from Liam. "Sleep well, my beautiful bride. Can't wait for our life to begin tomorrow." I stared at the screen, a smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth. He was right about one thing. A life was beginning tomorrow. But it wasn't the one he was expecting. I deleted the message and shut the laptop. For the first time in months, my heart rate slowed to a calm, predatory rhythm. I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the one holding the leash. Honestly, it's funny how a little bit of clarity can turn a wedding gown into a battle shroud. The morning sun crept through the curtains of the Lancaster estate, pale and indifferent, but I was already wide awake. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, watching the preparations for my execution with a detached, clinical interest. I spent the early hours not on makeup or hair, but on the phone, my voice low and devoid of the softness Liam had grown so used to. I called Julian Sterling, the CEO of Sterling National, the Lancasters' biggest rival, and the man Beatrice had spent decades trying to socially bankrupt. "Julian," I said, watching my own steady reflection in the window glass. "I'm ready to move the Heritage Foundation's liquidity, all of it. I want Sterling National to handle the acquisition of a certain failing bank's assets when they hit the floor tomorrow morning. I'm sending you the breach of contract evidence and the moral turpitude filings. Be ready for the 200% penalty trigger." Julian's voice was a mix of shock and predatory delight. "Elara? We've been trying to get a foot in their door for 10 years. You're handing me their head on a platter." "No, Julian," I replied, a cold smile touching my lips. "I'm handing you their throne. I just want the satisfaction of watching them realize who really built it." I hung up and began the delicate dance of the shadow strategy. I initiated a series of silent secondary wire transfers, micro movements of capital that wouldn't trigger immediate alarms, but would leave the Lancaster Bank's accounts as hollow as Beatrice's heart by the time the wedding march started. Every time I hit enter, it felt like a silent strike. I wasn't just a bride anymore. I was a surgeon, removing a tumor from the city's financial district. When Liam knocked on my door at 10 a.m., bringing me a pre-wedding cup of herbal tea, I felt a jolt of pure electricity run through my veins. My mind immediately flashed back to the conversation I'd overheard. The unauthorized medication, the planned accident, the life insurance claim. I looked at the steam rising from the cup, wondering if they'd already started their little experiment. "Good morning, beautiful," Liam said, his voice as smooth as the silk tie he was already wearing. He leaned down to kiss my forehead, and it took every ounce of my willpower not to recoil, as if I'd been touched by a reptile. "You look different today. Calm." "I am calm, Liam," I said, smiling with a warmth that didn't reach my eyes, my own version of a frozen lake. I realized that today is the day everything changes, for all of us. I took the cup but set it down on the vanity, untouched. "I'm just so touched that your mother had me sign that waiver. It really clarified where I stand." "She just wants us to be safe, Elara," he said, avoiding my gaze. He walked over to the nightstand and picked up the leather-bound folder. "I'll take this down to her office so she can have the notary finalize it before the ceremony." "Oh, wait," I said, my heart skipping a beat as I reached out. I noticed a tiny typo on page 49 while I was rereading it this morning. A misplaced decimal in the affiliate investment section. I fixed it with a pen and initialed it. You know how Beatrice is about perfection. I didn't want her to be embarrassed by a clerical error. Liam barely glanced at the page. To him, page 49 was just more filler in a document designed to crush me. He saw my initials next to a few lines of small, cramped legalese and nodded dismissively. "Thanks, babe. Mother will appreciate the attention to detail. See you at the altar." As the door clicked shut, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. That typo was the trigger for the 200% penalty. I had redefined affiliate investment to include every cent the Heritage Fund had ever moved into their bank. By fixing it, he had just personally delivered the weapon I would use to destroy him. The rest of the morning was a blur of white lace and deceptive smiles. The hairstylist and makeup artist treated me like a porcelain doll, never suspecting that the woman in the chair was currently orchestrating a multi-million-dollar financial collapse. I looked at my wedding dress hanging on the wardrobe, a stunning Vera Wang masterpiece that Liam's family had graciously paid for. I realized then that I wasn't putting on a wedding gown. I was putting on a costume for a funeral. I wonder if they'll still think I'm a valueless wildflower when they realize the dirt they've been trampling on is actually the foundation of their entire world. Honestly, being a puppet master is much more exhausting than being a victim, but the view is significantly better. The afternoon sun began to cast long, skeletal shadows across the estate, and while the florists were busy pinning white orchids to every pillar, I was busy securing the last pins in my own arrangement. Through a secure link on my phone, I accessed the encrypted feed from the miniature cameras my private security team had installed while the house was empty during the rehearsal dinner. One was tucked into the plush upholstery of the vintage Rolls-Royce waiting at the curb. The other sat behind a silver-framed portrait in Beatrice's private sitting room. I sat in my bridal suite, the heavy lace of my veil draped over a chair like a discarded ghost. On my screen, the black and white grain of the sitting room feed flickered. Beatrice was there, standing by her mahogany desk. She wasn't looking at guest lists or seating charts. She was holding a small, unmarked velvet box. With clinical precision, she pulled out 3 dangerous vials, slender glass tubes filled with a clear, viscous liquid. The restricted substance that was meant to turn my honeymoon into a medical tragedy. "Is the dosage correct?" Liam's voice came through the speakers, tinny but unmistakable. He appeared in the frame, adjusting his cufflinks, looking every bit the handsome groom. "I don't want any lingering symptoms. It needs to look like a sudden, catastrophic collapse." The chemist assured me it would trigger a severe nerve trauma within 4 hours of ingestion, Beatrice replied, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on a grave. She tucked the vials into a hidden pocket of her silk clutch. By the time the Maldives authorities reach the island, the substance will have metabolized into nothing. You'll be the grieving widower, and the bank will have its $50 million. It's a clean sweep, Liam.
I'll feel a little bad, Liam muttered, though he was smiling at his reflection in Beatrice's mirror. She really did love me, in her own pathetic way. It's almost a shame she's so replaceable. Beatrice walked over and smoothed the lapel of his suit, her eyes shining with a chilling maternal pride. Don't be sentimental, darling. It's a weakness we can't afford. Once the debt is cleared and the orphan problem is buried, we'll find you a wife with a real pedigree. Someone whose family actually appears in the social register, not someone who spent her childhood in government-funded basements.
We're simply pruning the garden to let the real roses grow. I felt a cold, sharp sensation in my chest, like a shard of ice had been driven into my heart. My fingers hovered over the screen. I had it all. The audio, the video, the visual proof of their unauthorized medication and their predatory intent. Part of me wanted to vomit. The other part wanted to laugh at the sheer blinding arrogance of it all. They were so confident in my insignificance that they were plotting my end in a house I was technically paying for. I looked at the clock. 2 hours until the ceremony. I sent a final burst of files to my legal team and the private investigator stationed near the church. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the hunter was about to become the trophy. I stood up and reached for my wedding dress, the silk feeling like cold armor. I wasn't just walking down an aisle. I was walking toward a reckoning. I had lived my whole life feeling like a guest in other people's homes, but today, I was the one holding the keys. As I pinned the veil to my hair, I looked at the camera one last time. Beatrice was laughing, a sound so hollow, it made the fine china on her desk rattle. She thought she was erasing a nobody. She didn't realize she was trying to delete the person who held her entire world together. If you've ever wanted to see a monster get exactly what they deserve, leave a comment right now, because the Wildflower is about to turn into a forest fire. The air inside the cathedral was thick with the scent of 5,000 white roses, a cloying, heavy fragrance that felt more like a funeral than a celebration. As the massive oak doors creaked open, the wedding march began to swell, the organ notes vibrating through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. Every head turned. I saw the sea of faces, the titans of industry, the socialites, the vultures in silk and pearls, all waiting to see the lucky orphan claim her prize. I walked down the aisle with a slow, rhythmic grace, my face obscured by the fine mesh of the veil. I wasn't shaking. My hands were as steady as a surgeon's. Liam stood at the altar, looking every bit the Prince Charming I had once dreamed of. Beside him, Beatrice sat in the front row, her chin tilted upward, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying, triumphant light. She looked at me not as a daughter-in-law, but as a finalized insurance policy. I could almost see her calculating the interest on my life. As I reached the altar, Liam took my hand. His skin felt clammy, his grip a little too tight, as if he were afraid I might bolt before the trap snapped shut. The ceremony proceeded like a choreographed dream. The priest's voice droned on about holy matrimony and eternal devotion, words that sounded like a sick joke echoing in a hollow chamber. I looked past the priest's shoulder at the stained glass, thinking about the restricted vials currently sitting in Beatrice's clutch just a few feet away. I thought about the poverty waiver that had been notarized only an hour ago. The silence in the church grew heavy as the moment of truth approached. "Elara," the priest said, his voice echoing in the rafters, "do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" I let the silence stretch. 5 seconds. 10. The guests began to fidget. I could hear the rustle of silk and the quiet whispers of confusion. Liam squeezed my hand harder, a warning flash in his eyes. Beatrice leaned forward, her brow furrowing, the mask of the gracious hostess beginning to crack. The tension in the room was a physical weight, a wire pulled so taut it was humming. "Elara?" the priest prompted, his voice laced with concern. I slowly lifted the veil, pinning it back so I could look Liam directly in the eyes. I didn't see a husband. I saw a man who had debated the ethics of my survival over a glass of vintage scotch. I turned my head slightly to look at Beatrice. She was staring at me, her mouth a thin, hard line. I gave her a small, serene smile, the kind of smile you give a ghost. "I do," I said, my voice ringing out clear and resonant, sliced through the stillness of the cathedral. "I do agree to watch your empire turn to ash, Beatrice." The gasp that rippled through the pews was like a sudden gust of wind. Liam's face went from pale to a ghastly shade of gray.
"Elara, what are you doing? Is this some kind of joke?" he hissed, his voice cracking.
"No, Liam. The joke was the $200 ring and the $50 million insurance policy you took out on my life," I said. My voice projected so everyone in the first 5 rows could hear. I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress and pulled out the folded poverty waiver, the one Liam had so helpfully notarized for me. I held it up for the entire congregation to see. "Today was supposed to be the day the gold-digging orphan was silenced," I continued, my gaze sweeping over the horrified guests. "But instead, it's the day the Lancaster family answer for their crimes. I am officially calling off this wedding due to the groom's family engaging in a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud and endanger my life for an insurance payout." Beatrice stood up, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "How dare you! You're a delusional, basement-dwelling nobody! Security, remove this girl immediately!" "Sit down, Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping an octave, cold and lethal. "I'm not a nobody. I'm the chairman of the Heritage Investment Group. And according to this contract that you forced me to sign, you've just triggered a 200% default penalty on every cent I've used to keep your failing bank alive. You didn't just lose a bride today. You lost everything you own." The silence that followed my declaration was so heavy, it felt as if the cathedral's vaulted ceiling might collapse under the weight of it. Beatrice stood frozen, her hand clutching her pearls so tightly the string looked ready to snap. She looked at me with a mix of confusion and predatory instinct, still trying to process how the charity case had just spoken the name of the most powerful investment firm in the country. "The Heritage Group?" Liam stammered, his grip on my hand finally failing as his fingers went limp. "You're lying. You're just a girl who worked at a library. You can't be." "I am the Heritage Group, Liam. And I was the one person standing between your family and a federal bankruptcy hearing," I said, my voice echoing off the stained glass like a gavel. I reached into my bridal bouquet, pulling out a small encrypted smartphone I'd hidden among the lilies. My thumb pressed against the biometric scanner. Identity confirmed. With one deliberate tap on the screen, I authorized the Exodus protocol. The effect was instantaneous. It started with a single chime from a guest's pocket in the 3rd row, then another. Then a chorus of digital notifications began to ring out through the church, a frantic staccato symphony of financial panic. These weren't just wedding guests. They were the city's elite, and they all had real-time alerts set for the Lancaster Bank stock. "What is this?" a man in the 2nd row shouted, standing up and staring at his screen. "Lancaster stock just dropped 30% in 60 seconds. There's a massive capital withdrawal alert." I turned to Beatrice, whose face had drained of color, leaving her looking like a withered, gray statue of her former self. "You called me a wildflower, Beatrice. You said I lacked structure. But you forgot that wildflowers have deep roots. My roots go through every account in your bank. At this very second, the $100 million in liquidity I provided through my shell companies is being pulled. And because of the moral turpitude clause in that waiver, the one you were so eager to have me sign, I'm also collecting the 200% penalty for your breach of good faith." I pointed to the large projection screens on either side of the altar, which were supposed to show a slideshow of our love story. Instead, they flickered to life with a live feed of the global stock market. The ticker for Lancaster Bank, LNC, was a sea of red. The graph didn't just decline,
It fell like a stone off a cliff. "Your bank is currently in a freefall," I said, stepping away from the altar, my white train rustling behind me like the wake of a ghost ship. "By the time the markets close today, the Lancaster name will be worth less than the paper that waiver was printed on. You wanted to protect your legacy? You should have protected your soul instead." Beatrice's mouth worked, but no sound came out. She looked down at her clutch, where the restricted vials were hidden, then back at me. The realization was finally hitting her. She hadn't been plotting against a victim. She had been trying to poison the very hand that fed her. "You think you're so high and mighty?" I whispered, leaning in so only she and Liam could hear my voice. "You said I was a blank page. Well, I just wrote the final chapter of your life. I've been the one keeping you from sleeping in the street for the last 12 months. Now, I think it's time you saw how the other half lives." Liam grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic fear. "Elara, wait. We can talk about this. I love you. I didn't mean those things. I was just—" I pulled my arm away with a look of pure disgust. "You didn't love me, Liam. You loved the idea of a girl who wouldn't fight back while you buried her. But you forgot one thing about orphans. We're survivors. And we know exactly how to burn down a house that was never a home." Beatrice found her voice at last, a shrill, piercing sound that cracked the solemnity of the cathedral. "This is a fabrication, a calculated smear campaign by a disturbed girl who couldn't handle the reality of our social standing," she shrieked, her finger trembling as she pointed at me. "She's hacked the screens. She's desperate. Security! I said get her out of here!" But the security team I had hired, disguised as ushers, stood perfectly still. I didn't say a word. I simply swiped my thumb across the phone screen one more time. The stock ticker on the giant projection screens vanished, replaced by something far more devastating. The high-definition feed from the hidden cameras in Beatrice's study and the vintage Rolls-Royce. The audio boomed through the cathedral's professional sound system, every word crisp and undeniable. "By the time the Maldives authorities reach the island, the substance will have metabolized into nothing." Beatrice's recorded voice echoed through the rafters. On screen, the congregation watched in frozen horror as she held up the dangerous vials, her face twisted into that smug, predatory grin. Then came Liam's voice, asking if the restricted substance was foolproof. The footage cut to the car, where they discussed the insurance payout as if they were talking about a holiday bonus. The social suicide was instantaneous. A collective gasp, louder than the organ, swept through the pews. These people, the mayors, the judges, the CEOs, lived and died by reputation. Seeing the matriarch of the Lancaster family discuss a severe nerve trauma plot for insurance money was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Phones didn't just chime now. They were held high as everyone began recording the screens. The elite were doing what they do best, documenting the fall of one of their own to ensure they weren't caught in the blast radius. Is that a restricted substance she's holding?" A woman in the front row whispered, her voice amplified by the sudden stunned silence. They were going to do that to her? Beatrice looked around the room, and for the first time in her life, she saw her friends looking at her with genuine revulsion. Her kyungao, that ironclad arrogance that had been her armor for 40 years, was now a lead weight dragging her to the bottom of the ocean. She reached for the back of the pew to steady herself, her knuckles white. She looked like she had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. The public reckoning wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the absolute erasure of her dignity. "Liam, do something," she hissed, her voice now a pathetic, ragged plea. Liam looked at the screen, then at the guests, then at me. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor with the noose already tightening. "Elara, please," he whimpered, stepping toward me with his hands outstretched.
We can fix this. It was just talk. We were stressed about the bank. We would never have actually gone through with it. I love you, remember? We were supposed to be a team." "A team?" I laughed, and the sound was cold, echoing with the hollowness of my dead feelings for him. "You don't put a teammate in a life insurance policy, Liam. You don't feed a teammate unauthorized medication so you can pay off your gambling debts and your mother's vanity. You aren't a man. You're just a shadow in an expensive suit." I looked at Beatrice, who was now trembling so violently her pearls were rattling against her neck. She opened her mouth, perhaps to offer an apology, perhaps to beg for mercy. But the time for words had passed. The information asymmetry had been completely reversed. I knew everything, and now the world knew it too. In the high society circles of America, a scandal like this doesn't just get you uninvited from brunch. It gets you erased. Is an apology worth anything when it's only offered because the knife you were holding is now at your own throat? Honestly, I've never seen a more pathetic sight than a queen realizing her throne is made of cardboard. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral swung open for the second time that day, but the figures entering weren't late-arriving guests. A phalanx of officers in crisp uniforms moved down the aisle with a purpose that silenced the room more effectively than any wedding march could. They didn't look at the flowers or the gold-leafed altar. Their eyes were fixed solely on the two figures trembling in the center of the storm. Beatrice tried to summon one last shred of her former authority, straightening her silk jacket as the lead investigator approached. "This is a private event," she barked, though her voice lacked its usual steel. "Whatever this girl has shown you is a deep fake, a manipulation. I demand you leave this sacred space immediately." The investigator didn't even blink. He pulled a thick envelope from his pocket, a warrant signed by a federal judge only 2 hours prior. "Beatrice Lancaster, Liam Lancaster, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit financial fraud and endangerment. We have the unauthorized medication recovered from your residence, and the dangerous vials currently in your possession will be taken into evidence as well." The sound of the first pair of handcuffs snapping shut, a sharp metallic click, seemed to echo through every corner of the church. It was the sound of a legacy shattering. Liam's face went completely white as his hands were pulled behind his back. He looked around the room at the people he had spent his life trying to impress, but they all turned away, their faces twisted in disgust or buried in their phone screens. "Elara, please!" Liam cried out, his voice cracking as they began to lead him away. "Don't do this! I was just doing what I was told. My mother, she's the one who planned it all. I'm innocent!" I stood there, my hands folded calmly in front of my white gown, watching him with the detached curiosity of someone observing a specimen under glass. His betrayal didn't hurt anymore. It was just a pathetic display of a man who had never learned how to be human. I stepped forward, the silk of my dress rustling like a warning. "Arrogance leads to ruin, Liam," I said, my voice low but carrying through the stunned silence of the congregation. "You had 1,000 chances to choose the truth. You had 1,000 chances to choose me. Instead, you chose to be a predator's apprentice. You were so worried about me being an orphan without a home. Well, now you can enjoy your new home. I hear the state has plenty of room for people who trade lives for liquidity." Beatrice was led past me, her head bowed for the first time in her life. The restricted substance she had planned to use on me was now the very thing that would ensure her stay in a facility far less comfortable than her Hills estate. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. The wildflower she had tried to crush had grown into the walls of her prison. The entire process was clinical, transparent, and undeniably legal. As the police cars pulled away from the cathedral, sirens wailing in a chaotic harmony, I felt a strange, profound sense of stillness. Everything was out in the open. The Lancaster Bank was being seized by regulators, the family was in custody, and the girl they thought was a nobody was the last person standing. I looked at the altar, now empty and cold, and realized that justice doesn't always come in a courtroom. Sometimes, it comes in white lace with a $100 million receipt. Honestly, if being low class means having a conscience and a clean record, I'll take that over a dynasty any day. I walked out of the cathedral into the blinding midday sun, the heavy oak doors thudding shut behind me like the final beat of a heart. My private security team formed a corridor through the swarm of paparazzi and shocked socialites who had spilled onto the sidewalk. I didn't hide my face. I didn't duck into the car. Instead, I stood on the top step, pulled out my phone, and went live on the world's leading financial news platform. Within seconds, the viewer count spiraled into the hundreds of thousands. My name is Elara, and until 10 minutes ago, I was supposed to become a Lancaster, I said, my voice steady, amplified by the microphones of a dozen news crews. But instead of a marriage, there has been a transition of power. As the primary creditor and majority stakeholder of the Heritage Fund, I am officially announcing the immediate hostile acquisition of the Lancaster Banking Group's remaining assets. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Across the street, the digital ticker of a news building flickered. The Lancaster name was being erased in real time. Effective immediately, I continued. All viable accounts, infrastructure, and holdings formerly under the Lancaster name are being merged in the Sterling National. I am handing the keys of the Lancaster legacy to the one person Beatrice spent her life trying to destroy, Julian Sterling. The crowd erupted. It was the grand reversal. I wasn't just taking their money. I was handing their crown to their arch nemesis. For Beatrice, losing her fortune was a tragedy, but seeing the Sterling family, people she had called new money peasants for decades, move into her executive offices would be a living nightmare. I was erasing the Lancaster name from the city's skyline and replacing it with the very thing they feared most, a more competent rival. The Lancaster family thought they could trade my life for an insurance payout to save their pride, I told the camera, a cold, sharp smile playing on my lips. They thought a gold-digging orphan was an easy mark. But in their greed, they forgot that a bank is only as strong as its trust, and they broke that trust the moment they decided I was worth more to them as a medical statistic than as a human being. I looked down at the street where the police cruisers were disappearing around the corner. By merging their assets with Sterling, I had ensured that while the innocent employees would keep their jobs, the Lancaster family would never see a single penny of severance. Every remaining asset was tied up in the 200% penalty I had triggered with that poverty waiver. I had used their own weapon to skin their empire alive. They say the best revenge is living well, I said, catching a glimpse of my reflection in the dark glass of my waiting limousine. But I disagree. The best revenge is living well while taking every single cent they ever cared about. This isn't just a bankruptcy. It's an eviction of their entire existence from the halls of power. I ended the live stream. The world was already reeling, the information gap now filled with the shocking truth of a billionaire in disguise who had dismantled a dynasty in her wedding dress. Julian Sterling stood by the car, nodding to me with a look of profound respect, and perhaps a little bit of fear. He knew now that I wasn't someone to be underestimated. I had played the long game, and I had won, with a checkmate they never saw coming. Honestly, there's something incredibly cathartic about watching a legacy crumble when it was built on nothing but hot air and cruelty. I guess the Wildflower just bought the whole garden. I stepped into the back of the obsidian black limousine, the door closing with a heavy pressurized thud that silenced the chaotic roar of the paparazzi and the sirens. For a moment, I just sat there, in the cool, leather-scented shadows, listening to my own breathing. The air in here was filtered, clean, and expensive. A stark contrast to the cloying, suffocating scent of the 5,000 roses I'd just left behind. I looked down at the white lace covering my arms. It felt like a costume from a play that had finally closed its curtains. With a series of practiced movements, I reached for the hidden zipper at my side. I shed the wedding gown, letting the silk and lace crumple onto the floor of the car like the skin of a snake. Underneath, I wasn't wearing the orphan's slip. I was wearing a bespoke charcoal black power suit I'd had tailored months ago in London. It was sharp, structured, and commanding. As I adjusted the lapels and stepped out of the discarded white fabric, I felt the last of Elara the victim dissolve. I reached up and pulled the pins from my hair, letting the intricate bridal updo fall into a sleek, natural wave. I looked at the mirror in the bar console. My eyes were no longer wide with the need for approval. They were the eyes of a woman who had just performed a successful hostile takeover of her own life. The limousine pulled away from the curb, gliding past the rusty, beat-up sedan I had driven for 2 years to maintain my broke orphan cover. I looked at that car, a prop in a drama I no longer had to act in, and felt a wave of relief so profound it made my fingertips tingle. I was leaving the sedan behind, along with the girl who thought she had to hide her strength to be loved. I was leaving behind the girl who thought a man like Liam could ever be a sanctuary. As we rounded the corner toward the Lancaster estate, the driver slowed down. Through the tinted glass, I watched as a fleet of black SUVs, marked with federal seals, pulled into the driveway. Agents were already stretching yellow tape across those ornate iron gates Beatrice loved so much. I saw movers hauling out paintings, the very legacy items they had bragged about, now being tagged as seized assets to satisfy the 200% penalty I had triggered. The mansion looked smaller now, less like a palace and more like a hollowed-out shell. It was being yimfeng, sealed off by the very law they thought they were above. I watched a tow truck hook up Liam's silver convertible, the one he'd bought with a loan from the bank that I had secretly guaranteed. Every luxury they had used to look down on me was being systematically dismantled by the cold, impartial hand of a legal system. Justice wasn't a scream or a punch. It was a series of spreadsheets, a collection of affidavits, and a perfectly executed withdrawal of capital. I felt a visceral sense of closure as the house disappeared from view. The numbers didn't lie, and the numbers said the Lancasters were worth 0. I leaned back against the headrest, closing my eyes. For years I had searched for a family, for a place where I belonged. I had let myself be humiliated because I was starving for a home. But as the limousine accelerated toward the airport, I realized I had built my own home a long time ago. It was made of resilience, intelligence, and the $100 million foundation that no one could ever take from me again. I was no longer a wildflower in someone else's garden. I was the one who owned the land. Honestly, if living well is the best revenge, then doing it in a custom-tailored suit while your enemies are being processed into the system is the ultimate upgrade. I guess the only thing I'm mourning today is the fact that I didn't do this sooner. The penthouse terrace of the Heritage Foundation building offers a view of the city that feels almost like looking at a miniature model of a life I used to lead. Up here, the wind is crisp, carrying the scent of rain and the distant rhythmic hum of the financial district below. I stood by the glass railing, my fingers tracing the cold steel, feeling a sense of stillness that had taken me an entire year to earn. I was no longer running, no longer hiding, and most importantly, no longer waiting for someone else to tell me I was worthy. My assistant had left a folder on my mahogany desk earlier this morning, a final status report on the Lancaster bankruptcy proceedings. It was the last thread connecting me to that past life. I opened it and read the lines of sterile legal text that painted a picture of absolute poetic justice. Beatrice, the woman who once refused to touch a dinner plate if it wasn't fine bone china, was now reportedly assigned to the kitchen detail in a federal facility. She was spending her days scrubbing industrial pots and earning mere cents an hour, money that was being automatically garnished to pay back the millions she owed to my foundation. The woman who called me a weed was now learning exactly what it felt like to be at the bottom of the garden. As for Liam, the report was even more sobering. Stripped of his titles, his Rolex, and his dignity, he had been barred from the banking industry for life. My private investigators mentioned he was working 12-hour shifts as a bicycle courier, weaving through the same streets where he used to look down on people from the back of a chauffeured car. He was literally delivering packages to the buildings he once thought he owned. I felt a strange, detached calm as I read it. There was no surge of triumphant joy, no laughter, just a profound, hollow sense of correctness. They weren't being punished by me. They were being punished by the reality they had created. Their own arrogance had been the architect of their prison. I reached into the pocket of my cashmere coat and pulled out a small, tarnished object. It was the $200 diamond ring Liam had given me on the night he proposed. I looked at it in the sunlight. It was a pathetic thing, a piece of glass set in cheap metal, pretending to be something of value. For a long time I had kept it as a reminder of my own blindness, a scar I refused to let heal. But standing here now, at the summit of the empire I had built and protected, I realized I didn't need a scar to remember the lesson. I held the ring out over the edge of the terrace. Far below, the river snaked through the city, its dark waters churning with the current. With a simple flick of my wrist, I let it go. I watched as a little spark of fake light tumbled through the air, smaller and smaller, until it hit the surface with a tiny, insignificant splash. It sank instantly, disappearing into the depths, just like the illusion of the family I had so desperately wanted. The weight that had been sitting on my chest for a year finally vanished. I wasn't an orphan looking for a home anymore. I was the home. I was the foundation. I turned my back on the river and walked toward the glass doors of my office. My phone buzzed. A notification of a new charitable project I was launching for foster youth. A new chapter was beginning, and for the first time, it was written in my own handwriting, with ink that wouldn't fade. Honestly, watching a fake diamond sink is a lot more satisfying than wearing it. Some things are just meant to be at the bottom of the river. The gala was held in the same ballroom where, exactly 2 years ago, I had attended my first society event as Liam's shadow. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. The gold leaf on the pillars didn't feel like a cage, and the air didn't taste like judgment. The banners draped from the ceiling bore the crest of the Heritage Foundation, and the guest list was filled with people who were here to build, not to belittle. I walked through the crowd, no longer the broken orphan in a thrift store dress, but a woman whose name carried the weight of 100 successful rescues. I stopped at a table near the front, where a group of children from the local foster network were sitting. They looked overwhelmed, their small hands clutching juice glasses, their eyes wide as they took in the luxury of the room. One little girl, maybe 7 years old, was staring at me. She had messy braids and a dress that was a little too big for her, a mirror image of the girl I used to be. She looked at my suit, then at the way people moved aside when I walked, her expression a mix of awe and a quiet, heartbreaking hope. "Are you the queen of this castle?" she whispered, as I knelt down to her level, the silk of my trousers brushing the carpet. I smiled, and for the first time in a long time, the warmth reached my eyes. "No, honey," I said, my voice soft enough only for her to hear. "I'm the architect, and I used to sit exactly where you are sitting right now." She looked confused, her brow furrowing. "But my teacher says I don't have a legacy because I don't have a mommy or a daddy to give me one. She says I have to work twice as hard to be someone." I took her small hand in mine. Her skin was warm, a reminder of the life and potential that people like Beatrice Lancaster would have simply stepped over. "Listen to me," I said, my voice firm with a conviction that had been forged in the fires of betrayal.
Don't you ever let anyone tell you that you don't have value just because you don't have a famous last name. A name is just a label on a box. What matters is what's inside. You aren't a blank page for someone else to write on. You are the one holding the pen. You write your own value, and you make it so high that they couldn't afford you even if they sold their entire world. She beamed, a gap-toothed grin that felt more valuable than every cent I'd taken from the Lancasters. I stood up, smoothing my jacket, and felt the circle finally close. The loop of trauma, of seeking validation from monsters, was broken. A new loop was beginning, one built on truth, on power used for protection, and on the knowledge that the best way to honor your past is to make sure no one else has to survive it alone. As I walked toward the stage to give my keynote address, I caught a glimpse of the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere out there, the Lancaster name was a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. But here, in this room, a new legacy was being born. I had turned my heartbreak into a roadmap, and my rage into a foundation. I was no longer an orphan. I was a matriarch of a different kind. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If you enjoyed seeing the Wildflower burn down the mansion to build a sanctuary, don't forget to like and subscribe. We have many more stories of high IQ justice and poetic karma coming your way. Remember, never underestimate someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Until next time.